Okay, this is the last of the mini lectures relating to the classification of economic activities. Remember, you'll have two more after this on economic systems and spatial patterns of labor. Both those are relatively short. In this last one, though, in the area of classification, I want to talk about tertiary activities. And so again, if we think about value added, we had raw material extraction or growing, in other words, farming, mining, forestry, etc. And then we had, so that produced logs. If you talk about forestry, logs went into manufacturing to make a table. But the manufacturing of that table relies on several levels of what we would call tertiary activities. For example, the person that sells the table. Sales is an activity that provides a service to primary and secondary activities. In other words, the sale of them. They also provide a service to the general community, and that might be, for example, now we've sold a table, but that table is used in a restaurant to provide meals. We also would say the tertiary activities involve any of those things that serve the general community. So healthcare services, insurance are types of general community tertiary activities. Now, it is important to distinguish, and again, earlier I pointed out that there are these ideas of quaternary and quinary sectors, and most economists, well, most economic geographers would put those inside tertiary activities. Now, what we mean by this, and again, focus on this in terms of studying, tertiary activities are businesses, service to the general population. Okay, and so that's kind of the broad area. So anyone that serves other people, any service to other people. When we look at the quaternary sector, this tends to be those with that sector that deals with complex processing or knowledge. And so an engineer that designs the software that in fact builds the table, or that is used in the automation of automobile plants. That is the quaternary sector. So engineering firms, firms that design those types of things. Then you have at the very highest level, and with in fact the fewest people involved in it, is what we would call a quinary sector. And so these are, if you will, the decision makers. In other words, this is the part of the economy that consults, that comes in and helps make very complex decisions based on the knowledge produced in the quaternary sector to apply to the tertiary sector, the secondary sector, or the primary sector. And so, again, as we've moved up in our sectors, the number of people in the tertiary sector in each one of these. So tertiary sector may have a very broad range, anything from a busboy to a general manager at a Walmart. Once we go to the quaternary sector, though, we're going to have fewer of those people necessary to support the tertiary sector, and oftentimes in the quinary sector, even smaller. The other thing that happens here, though, is that all of these become much more influenced by where people are than necessarily where raw materials are. All right, so let's take a look at this. So first of all, one of the things that you're going to notice here is that as we look at the world, the services sector, this is essentially that, broadly speaking, all of the tertiary sectors begin to be more and more important in terms of GDP. And that is true throughout the world. It is important to understand that, again, this is value added. The cost or the value of the software that automates the machine that makes a table is in fact much more valuable than the table itself or the wood that is used to make it. So again, GDP that results from the tertiary sector is very, very large. And in fact, in the United States, it's a significant component of our economy, as it is in Western Europe. It is less so in those countries that still have significant manufacturing bases. Okay, so let's think about this. The raw material, if you will, for the tertiary sector, for the most part, is education. If we really think about the service sector, the tertiary sector, and we exclude the hourly component of it, the hourly wage service sector, which is, again, a very significant portion. One of the easy ways to thinking about this is when we look at, in fact, tertiary education. And the two terms work together. Tertiary education means anyone that is a skilled is attended technical school, that is past high school, or has gone to university or beyond. And so that is in fact the raw material for the tertiary sector, is in fact skills knowledge. And so what we see is that in fact, where we look at the highest levels of this, again, the United States, for example, Japan, Europe, we see that this is fairly high in many of those countries that have a high sector that is tertiary. Now, it's not always the case, and again, you'll notice that there is a moderate level in some parts of Central Europe, even though the tertiary sector is quite important to their economy. So again, if we kind of go backwards on this, you'll notice that again, here, France is a good example, and Great Britain have very, very high levels of services in their GDP, and yet they're high. They're not quite as high as the United States or as Canada, Russia, Australia. And so again, the United States has an inordinately high level of tertiary education. Now, what's important about that though is it translates into those quaternary and quinary levels. And so if we look at this, one indicator of the quaternary and quinary indication is this idea of patents. And so when we look at patents, patents are a way, in other words, a patent is, in fact, a quaternary or quinary piece of value added. And so what we notice is that in terms of patents, the United States, Japan, then China, these are the countries that in fact produce ideas, okay, the largest level of idea production. And so we can see that that's very much an important part of our economy. Now, the other way that we can see this is how this has changed over time. And so if we look at this map, this is just the United States. If we looked in 1990, most of the states had the highest level of employment in the areas of manufacturing and then retail trade. In other words, if you look really at the country, that was virtually all there was, with the exception of Nevada, which had, again, the gambling and casino component, Hawaii, which also has tourism. Now, if we go to today, or at least 2013, what we notice very quickly is that service components of the tertiary economy have radically altered the landscape. So you can see in most of the United States, healthcare becomes the highest employment, and that is a service sector. Retail trade, again, another component of service sector, is also present, as is accommodations and food service. It is only in a very few states where manufacturing is still the most important component in terms of employment. So if we look at this then in terms of changes, what we can see in the United States, 2008 to 2018, if we look at changes in terms of sectors, what we can see is manufacturing is dropping off, mining is dropping off. Virtually all of the areas of growth, professional services, healthcare services, government, construction is really the only secondary area of significant growth. Leisure, educational services, retail trade, financial activities, transportation, wholesale trade, information, utilities, mining, you'll notice are all dropping. And so what we've seen is in the United States, the service sector, the tertiary sector, again, quaternary and quinary, are all the growth areas. And again, that can be seen in terms of our GDP. This is at each sector in terms of its percent of GDP. In the United States, 75% of our GDP comes from that tertiary sector. Secondary sector, roughly 23%. Now, if we look across the world, what ends up happening is countries move through this process. And so what we can see again, Nepal, very rural country, largely primary sector, largely subsistence. Tertiary sectors, a little bit there, and interestingly enough, that's largely tourism. Then we look at somewhere like Brazil, its tertiary sector is growing, its secondary sector remains moderately high, roughly equivalent to the United States, and where the growth in the tertiary sector kind of overpaces is the agricultural or primary sector. Okay, so with that, we are done with the classification of economic activities. We'll pick this up with economic systems in our next mini lecture.